$200. It doesn't sound like much, right? It's what you might spend on a week's groceries, maybe a night out. But in this story, that $200, it was the spark that lit an unbelievable tragedy. And yeah, that $200, that became the price tag for a man's life. It kicked off a chain of events that would stretch over 3 decades and end in a really controversial and historic moment for American justice. And right at the center of this whole 32-year ordeal is one man, Anthony Todd Boyd. What he did on a hot summer night back in 1993 would seal his fate, a fate that, believe it or not, would eventually make headlines all around the world. So yeah, this is the story we're unpacking today. It's about a truly brutal crime, a long, long wait on death row, and an execution that forces us to ask some really tough questions about what justice even means. So let's actually start at the end, because this isn't just any capital punishment case. The way Anthony Todd Boyd died is a huge part of the story. It connects a crime from decades ago to a very, very modern controversy. Boyd's execution was only the second time ever that Alabama or any state in the U.S. had used nitrogen hypoxia. I mean, think about that. This wasn't some routine procedure. It was practically unprecedented. And to understand why it happened, we have to go all the way back to the beginning. Okay, so let's rewind. We're going back to the summer of 1993 in Talladega County, Alabama. A small debt, reportedly for cocaine, was about to just explode into an absolute inferno. On the night of August 8th, the sequence of events was just swift and horrific. A man named Gregory Huguley was taken by Anthony Todd Boyd and 3 other people over that $200 debt. They drove him out to an empty, deserted baseball field, tied him to a bench, covered him in gasoline, and set him on fire. And he was alive when it happened. And make no mistake, this wasn't some crime of passion. The prosecution argued this was a calculated, cruel act. It was a killing designed, and this is their words, to send a message about what happens when you don't pay up. The crime itself was just shocking, but the legal journey that followed, it was a slow, grinding process that would stretch out for more than 3 decades. So let's take a look at how we got from the verdict to that final execution. So Boyd was convicted of capital murder. Prosecutors pointed to him as the ringleader, the one who gave the order. Now, his defense tried to argue that, hey, he didn't physically light the match. But the jury, they didn't see a difference. They decided the guilt was collective, that all of them were responsible for the horror of that night. And when it came to sentencing, the jury's recommendation was pretty clear. Even if it wasn't unanimous, 10 jurors voted for the death penalty. 2 voted for life in prison. Now, that is an overwhelming majority, and it was enough for the judge to hand down the death sentence. But that little crack of dissent, it would become a theme in the decades of appeals to come. And just like that, the long wait began. For 32 years, Boyd lived on death row. He went from being a young man to being in his 50s as the legal system just churned through his case. Every single appeal was ultimately denied, bringing him one step closer to his execution date. And that brings us to the execution method itself. Because Alabama was facing all these challenges with lethal injection, legal hurdles, supply problems, they turned to a new and deeply divisive alternative. And this is where the story takes a really unique turn. So what in the world is nitrogen hypoxia? Well, let's break it down. It's basically a process where a person is forced to breathe only pure nitrogen. Without oxygen, your body's cells, and especially your brain, just shut down. First comes unconsciousness, then death. Now, this is where the debate just explodes. The state of Alabama said this was a more humane method, a solution to the problems with lethal injection. But critics, including a lot of human rights groups, they fired back, saying it's experimental, it's unproven, and they raised serious questions about whether it could cause a really painful and torturous death. So how does it actually work? Well, the procedure itself sounds pretty straightforward. A mask is sealed tightly over the person's face. Pure nitrogen starts flowing in, replacing the air. The person passes out from lack of oxygen, and death follows, usually within a few minutes. So on October 23, 2025, after 32 years on death row, the final chapter of Anthony Todd Boyd's life was written. But the story, well, it was far from over. The final moments were recorded with chilling precision. At Holman Correctional Facility, the nitrogen gas started to flow at exactly 6 p.m. Just 13 minutes later, at 6:13 p.m., Anthony Todd Boyd was pronounced dead.
For the family of the victim, Gregory Huguley, this moment wasn't really about celebration. It was about stillness. They said they had lived with the echo of his screams for over 3 decades. For them, the execution represented the hope that maybe, just maybe, that echo might finally start to fade.
You know, there's this reflection on the case that's just haunting. It makes you think about how the most horrific things aren't always done by monsters, but by ordinary people who get so angry they start to believe that violence makes them powerful. And that leaves us with this huge, lingering question, doesn't it? A man was burned alive over a $200 debt. 32 years later, the state executed his killer by taking away his heir. It's a question with no easy answer. When we use the mechanics of death to punish death, what is the true nature of that justice?